we first had the opportunity to, really listen to Chetna talk about the work that she's doing with bees. In fact, at a different session that was hosted some months ago by the Indian Institute of Human Settlements. And in fact, at the time, Chetna, if I'm not mistaken, you were actually talking about this work in the context of urban development and urban planning. And today we are having this conversation in the context of food systems, which, in itself demonstrates the interconnectedness between these various things. Chetna is a senior research fellow at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, a tree. And, I remember asking Chetna in one of our first conversations, what other work she might be doing, besides her focus on bees. And she said very clearly that all she works on is bees. So we really have amongst us an expert on pollinators. She studies the bee community in and around the city of Bangalore. And her main interest really is in understanding how bees, as well as other pollinators, navigate urban landscapes and, and what can be done really to make our cities better for them. Especially, she is leading a project called the Bee Garden Project, which is a citizen science initiative where she and her colleagues are setting up bee hotels around the city to gather information on on nesting bees, and then what more hence can be done for conservation of pollinators. And it was really when she spoke about this, when I first heard her talk, that I immediately thought that there's a lot for us to learn from what they're doing. So without much ado, I will hand over to Chetna. For those of you who are just joining us, welcome. We are recording this session, and we'll have time towards the end for questions and answers and comments. But please feel free to use the chat, and if there's an interesting interjection, then we might be able to take some questions during the session as well. Thank you so much, Chetna, for being with us. I'll hand over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Priya, for that really, really nice introduction. That was very generous, and I feel a bit worried now that you said that I'm an expert on bees. What we can do today is just sort of discuss the role that pollinators, bees and others have in our food, and I'll just sort of walk you through our study and research the past several years. And I hope it'll be a nice discussion at the end as well. If anybody has questions at any point, please feel free to stop me. Of course, we can also take questions at the end and have a discussion if that's okay with everybody. I'll just share my screen.
Yeah, we can see it, Chetna.
Yeah, great. Okay, right. So as Priya mentioned, my colleagues and I at A3, we've been studying.
So sorry to interrupt you right away. Would you like to put it in full screen mode?
It is in full screen mode.
Now it is. Maybe there was a little bit of a lag. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. All right. So the buzz about food. We'll see what this is all about very shortly. And the research and information that I present today is basically not just done by me, but also my colleagues. That's Jagdish Sunil and Dr. Subhadra Devi, who heads our team. Right. So here are a bunch of pictures on your screen, as you can see, of course. I'd love to know if there's any of you who's attending today who's not eaten one of these food products, say, in the last couple of days. So that's sunflower, it's coconut, it's coffee, apple, almonds, it's cardamom, it's green chilies, mango. Yes, perhaps we haven't eaten that in a while, but I'm sure we're looking forward to. And the last one is cucumber. Yes, anybody?
Well, except the mango, definitely ate everything in the last couple of days.
Thanks, Priya. Right. Yes, so as you might have guessed by now, all these foods are dependent on pollinators, and we'll see what uh, these pollinators do. Right. So, what is the connection between food and pollinators? The connection is actually really, really strong, and it goes back to when plants and pollinators co-evolved. So that it's a very, very ancient connection. Um, how much of our food really depends on pollinators? It's something like about 75%, and I would say this is a bit of a conservative estimate. And not just fruits, vegetables, nuts, oilseeds, pulses, those kinds of things. But pollinators are also responsible for livestock feed. So when you add the meat and dairy industry, that figure really just goes up. I'd also like to point out that, of course, pollinators pollinate food plants, but they also have a very significant ecological value because pollinators pollinate all sorts of plants, not just food plants. So they sort of underpin most of terrestrial plant biodiversity in that sense. Um, and when we talk about crops, of course, there's the angle of agricultural productivity. So pollinators have a very, very significant role in agricultural productivity. We'll discuss this in the coming slides. And of course, it's of no surprise to us then that pollinators also influence livelihoods. These would be livelihoods of people who are dependent on these products, agriculture, or even several commercial products. Of course, pollinators are well, sort of the secret agents behind nutrition security, and we'll come to that shortly. So let's so now you have an idea of what the connection is between pollinators and food. So I just like to take a second to see what would happen if pollinators disappeared or even just drastically declined. If you say that a typical market might look something like this, if there are no pollinators, what do you think it would look like? It would be missing a lot. Let's look at something closer. Let's think of our own plates of food, because not everybody is eating burgers and ice cream sundaes, but this is just representative. So if this is what your plate could look like with pollinator dependent foods, this is how it would look without. And actually, you wouldn't even have the vanilla ice cream, and you'll see why. Right. So we've been talking about pollinators for a bit now. So who are these pollinators? So of course, I'm sure we are all aware there are several agents of pollination, and these are even wind, water, and air. But we are going to be focusing on animal-mediated pollination in this talk. So animals of all sizes, shapes, types are pollinators. Of course, we have bees that are a very prominent group of pollinators, but flies, beetles, butterflies are also equally sometimes more important. In some parts of the world, even birds pollinate plants, and of course, even mammals like bats are also pollinators. So yeah. So when we talk about foods that are dependent on pollinators, what do I really mean by that? When I say dependent, there's a whole spectrum of dependence, and you can see that from the table on the right. So the foods on the top have very low dependence or no dependence, and the ones at the bottom are extremely highly dependent, and the section at the very bottom is absolutely strongly dependent on pollination. So if there's no pollination by animals, the crops.
ಏನಾರ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಒಂದೇ ತನಕ ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಕೊಡೋದ್ ಯಾಕೆ ಅಷ್ಟೊಂದು ಯೋಚನೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ಯಾ ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಕಡೆ ಇದೆ ಕತೆ ತಾನೆ.
Could we ask everyone to go on mute, please? So sorry about that, Chetna.
no problem at all. Yes, so like I was saying, the foods at the very bottom just wouldn't exist if there were no pollinators. And when I say a spectrum of dependency, um, the plants on the top, which have lower dependency, typically need pollination for improving yield. And the ones that have higher dependency require pollination for seed set, and we will see why they require this. So now there are several food crops which sort of do seem to be able to exist without pollinators. So what's the big difference between a pollinated food and an unpollinated food? Well, here's what it would look like. Pollination is basically transfer of genetic material from one plant or one flower to the flower of a different plant. So what it does is it encourages good genetic mixing and the production of good fruit as a result. And this is not just in terms of quality of fruit, it's also quantity of fruit. So it's both taste as well as yield. And it's very common to see misshapen fruits, like you can see in the case of the pears, strawberries, and the cucumber. And this is a result of poor pollination. It needn't even be no pollination. Even very poor pollination can result in fruit that's deformed or not good enough. And studies have also recorded that this makes a very significant difference in taste. I'd like to just speak of a very interesting food-pollinator relationship. I'll just talk of one for the lack of time. Maybe we could discuss more later. So does anybody know what this flower is on the left-hand side? Please speak into the mic if you have an answer.
The cocoa flowers?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yes, so this is Theobroma cacao, so that's chocolate, cocoa, like you rightly said. So I just want to talk about this really interesting story of how chocolate is made, pollinated. So as some of you must be aware, chocolate has very, very small flowers. You can see a really small couple of flowers in the picture on the right, but they're basically whitish in color and they grow directly on the trunk of the plant. These flowers are really small. They're like half the size of, say, your fingernail or even smaller. So, who pollinates these flowers, you might wonder. There is only one particular insect type that can pollinate this, and these are called biting midges. These are from the family Ceratopocunidae. But these are really, really tiny flies, and you can barely see them with your naked eye. You can see the fly on the right corner in the left, in the picture on the left. So this is what it looks like, and it's actually a bit of a miracle that cacao even gets pollinated, because I'll tell you why. The flowers of the cacao tree, they're open for a very, very short period. So for a day or a little more. And the window of pollination is therefore really small. Also, very few of the flowers that do get pollinated set fruit. So that makes the odds even higher. So what are the requirements of a pollinator that needs to pollinate these kind of tiny flowers? Of course, it's got to be smaller than the flower because it has to go inside, reach the reproductive parts. And in the case of cacao, the flower is sort of hooded. So you need to be able to crawl right in and access the pollen. It also needs to be able to live in the conditions that cacao grows, which is hot, humid, and damp conditions. And it also needs to have sufficient number of, say, body hair, so that it can pick up the pollen particles that they get trapped on the body of the pollinator. And then it needs to visit enough number of flowers so so that it's able to cross-pollinate, take pollen from one flower to another. So, looks like this little flight has managed to do it, and we really need to be thankful for it because we aren't making it really easier for the fly. So the fly is, of course, no surprises, it's under threat because a lot of the kind of cultivation that is practiced with the cacao has been changing. So initially it was a sort of shade-loving plant and it was grown as a shade plant. It was basically not grown in the open sun, but cultivation is slowly shifting. So it's being grown without shade so that you get better yield. But what this means for the pollinator is that the conditions for survival are getting harder because the larvae of these midges, they like really moist conditions. So they enjoy very damp leaf litter and they need basically shade to keep things, humid and wet. So we really have to sort of think about how we're going to manage, growing cacao cultivation as well as preserving the pollinators along with it. Because if there's no pollinator, there is going to be no cacao. And even in the unlikely event that, we think of some way around it, maybe hand pollinate perhaps. So, you take a tiny little forceps and try to carefully pollinate the flower as best as you can in that small time window that you have. It's a very laborious task. And that would mean that the cost of cocoa would just shoot up and a lot of us wouldn't be able to afford it as easily. Let's talk about the economics of pollination. So we've spoken about how the connection between pollinators and plants is so integral, but let's look at it from the term of, in the angle of economics. So the valuation of animal pollination to annual agricultural output is about $224 to $577 billion. This was in 2015, and the figure surely is much higher now. 33% of Indian agriculture was estimated to rely on animal pollination, with insect pollination values standing at around 22 billion USD annually. And this again is done in 2017 by a study by Chaudhary and Chand. So this is a sort of more conservative figure. If anything, it would be higher than this. What I'd also like to point out is that several of the crops that are dependent on pollinators, such as cocoa, coffee, soya bean, palm oil, avocados, and several others, these are cash crops for several lower income countries. So from an economic point of view, pollinators play a really major role. How about nutrition? So not just do pollinators pollinate a lot of the food plants we eat, they also, interestingly, happen to pollinate foods that are considered highly nutritious. So to give you an idea of what is not pollinator dependent, those would be things like our cereals, rice, wheat, corn, and more starchy vegetables like potatoes, yam. So these are not pollinator dependent. And I'm sure you have a very good idea of what kind of nutrition they are able to provide. And also these foods undergo a lot of processing before they're consumed. So whatever little nutrition they do have definitely gets cut down by the time it reaches us. On the other hand, foods that are pollinated have a lot of the other kinds of nutrients that we need. And this is a majority of available dietary lipids, vitamins A, C, and E. In fact, almost all of the sources of vitamin C, more than 90%, lycopene and several antioxidants are all pollinator mediated foods. There are also several minerals. A large portion of these, in fact, come from pollinator mediated foods. And these would be calcium, fluoride, iron, folic acid, and others. What's also very interesting is that um, there are some crops which have an increased yield because of pollination. Like I mentioned earlier, not like they will not fruit if there are pollinators. It's just that the yield gets better. Even in the case of these crops, um, it has been studied that the nutrition gets compromised if there is no pollination. So even in that case, pollinators seem really, really vital for nutrition security. Let's look at what's happening in terms of dependence on pollinators. What are the trends like all over the world? Firstly, several studies, such as the one I quoted here, show that there's been a huge increase in area under cultivation of pollinator-dependent crops. And this obviously implies that dependence on pollination service is increasing and will continue to do so. In fact, the figures are quite startling. So the production of pollinator-dependent crops has increased by 300% in the last 50 years. If you wonder why this is the case, that's because as affordability improves, people seem to want to shift to diets that are more diverse and nutritionally richer. And that just basically means that you're going to be moving towards pollinator dependence. Also, what is of importance is to note that dependence is not uniform across the globe. So there seems to be higher pollination dependence in countries which have agriculture-based economies, because of course they depend on these food crops not just for nutrition but also for trade. Yes. So my team and I felt that we really want to see what our dependence is, because all these papers that you read are typically studies conducted somewhere else, and you want to know what your diet says. So we did a survey a couple of years ago, and we asked people what they eat and how much they eat, how often they eat, in fact, and this is what it looks like. So around 45 to 55% of our diets of Bangaloreans seem to be dependent on pollinators. That's the purple bit, and also the greenish bit, which is dependent for seed production. This orangish bit, which says not pollinator dependent, is again a bit, again, it's not a very clear picture, because these are foods that are not directly pollinator dependent. And this could be something like, dairy or meat or eggs. But if you really take the time to analyze what the animals are eating, the ones that give us these products, you would see that they too require a lot of pollinator dependent crops as their livestock feed. So this is again a very conservative estimate of dependence. So we thought we want to see what are the foods that we eat that seem to be pollinator dependent. So we came up with categories of pollinator dependence, which was yes dependent, not dependent, partially dependent, and dependent only for seed production. So for the sake of the clarity, let's just focus on the yes and the no categories. That's the very top, the very bottom. Then we came up with a usage score that's on the x-axis. So this tells you how often that food item is used in your diet, or rather consumed in diet, in everyday diets. And this is what we see. We see that things like spices and vegetables seem to be very, very common staple part of our diets, and they're also highly pollinator dependent. Another food group that shows up is, of course, fruits and also cooking oils. So I think what a lot of us don't, sort of realize quickly is that a lot of cooking medium is also, from pollinator dependent crops. So most of the oils, almost all of the oils that we use are highly pollinator dependent. So even if you say that you don't really like to eat too many fruits and vegetables, or only if you or if you say you like to eat only certain fruits and vegetables, which aren't perhaps, terribly pollinator dependent, if they're more sort of self-pollinated, even in that case, your dependence on pollinators is really high. It's absolutely sort of there in most diets across the world, and certainly in an Indian diet, like we've seen from the Bangalore study. Of course, pulses are also a very important part of our diets across the country. So these are the food groups that really stand out. So we've spoken about how important pollinators are to food and why they're important. Yeah.
Chetna, there was a question in the chat. Can
Oh,
I
yes. Yeah.
can I share it with you? Because it
Yes,
might be
please.
relevant to the previous section. So Kaushik has a question. Is pollination dependency less in places like the US where there is extensive monocrop farming and also where there is a lot of usage of chemicals? In that case, what happens to pollination? How is it ensured? Or are there varieties now that don't require pollination because of industrial forms of agriculture? Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question, Kaushik. And I'd love to talk about this right now. It's a good time. Yes, pollination is lower in crops such as corn. In fact, they don't need pollinators. So when you say the USA, I imagine you're talking about those kind of crops, right? So yes, of course, pollination dependent is very low. Um, so monoculture, of course, if you have a monoculture of pollinator dependent crops, that would mean that dependence is high. And of course, if the monoculture is one of pollinator independent crops, then yes, pollinator dependence is low. But that's the pattern we kind of see that, even countries such as USA or other countries which grow a lot of crops that are not, that don't require pollinators, they still import a lot of crops which do require them. And these crops make a very important addition to the diet of the people in those places. And we see why, because nutritionally, all these food groups that are pollinator dependent are so significant. And when you talk of pesticide use, of course, well, pesticide use doesn't directly affect pollinator dependence, so to say. It affects the pollinator, of course, you're right. So in cases where there's high pesticide or even fertilizer use, of course, you see pollinators being affected very drastically. And different kinds of pollinators are affected differently depending on their life history cycles and a lot of other factors. So we can discuss that maybe later in the talk. So yes, if you have extremely dependent crops and you use a lot of pesticides, of course, that means that you will surely have some sort of problem because pollinators will just not be there or they'll die out, and surely that will impact yield. I will continue. And are there any other questions?
No, not at the moment, Chetna.
Not-
We can go ahead.
Okay. Right. So I was talking about pesticide earlier, and this is unfortunately the current situation that there is a lot of usage of these chemicals in agricultural fields across the world, and not just pesticide usage. Habitat loss is a primary factor of not just pollinator loss, most of biodiversity loss everywhere. And things such as climate change just worsen the picture because climate change affects, flowering cycles of plants and phenology traits. So this means that certain crop or plant just doesn't flower when it typically should have. So it gets harder for pollinators to, ensure that they get food throughout the year, and even when faced with sort of erratic climate patterns. In fact, there are lots of studies, and there's one done by our group as well, which studied how drought affects pollinators. And what the study sort of found out is that diversity of pollinators is really critical. which means you can't manage with just one species of, say, bee or fly or beetle. You need a very good diversity. So you need multiple species of these pollinating insects to ensure that pollination is not interrupted when there is some unexpected event, when there is like heavy rains one year, or when there's like a very hot summer or something like that. You see that one species of pollinator sort of steps in when another group of pollinator population goes low, and this is temporary, of course, but it is only because there are multiple species, because it's diverse, that something like this can happen. And in the case where just have one species of, say, honeybee pollinating your crop, and something happens to the honeybee colonies, then that would be a very unpleasant situation. And actually, like you mentioned earlier, Kaushik, you were asking me how they manage in such cases. In such cases, when you need pollinators, but there aren't enough pollinators around. So one of the things that's done, not just in the USA, even in India, is the usage of bee boxes. So these are boxes of bee colonies, beehives, and these are typically honeybees, of course, social bees. So these are sort of transported from field to field depending on the season and demand. So it's a business, in fact, and you can see large trucks carrying hundreds of these bee boxes moving from one place to another. So what they do is they place these bee boxes in the crop field during the time that the crop needs pollination, and then they move it based on who's ready to sort of take them and host them, or who needs them. So this is again not a great situation, because you're relying on one species of honeybee or one species of social bee to pollinate. And we've seen that a lot of disease outbreak can happen more easily when you look at honeybees. So it would really be advisable to try and preserve a good diversity of pollinators so that this doesn't happen. And of course, it's worrying that when the IPBES report predicts that 40% of invertebrate pollinator species, mainly butterflies and bees, are at imminent risk of extinction. So we really have to sort of do something soon. So this kind of brings me to the second half of the talk today, which is about pollinators in urban spaces. And I'll tell you how it's connected to what I've been talking about previously. Yeah, so what's happening in urban spaces in India today? Well, it's predicted that in less than 10 years, 6-7 years, India's city dwelling population is going to double. And we see that by 2050, 68% of the world is going to be living in urban areas. So urban areas are just growing and growing. And anybody who lives in Bangalore or any other city in India, I'm sure will attest to that fact. Because, you see a green space one day, and a couple of months later, it's built up. So that's the case everywhere. So of course, this means that there's a loss of natural vegetation and of open spaces. And what is another worrying factor is that rural and agricultural landscapes perhaps aren't as favorable to bees as one might imagine. And this is actually a result of one of the studies we have done, and several other studies that have been published as well. We see that rural landscapes seem to have surprisingly lower species diversity of species richness of pollinators, which means fewer species of pollinators basically. So looks like maybe those spaces aren't great for pollinators, perhaps because of pesticides or even monocultures. So all this sort of leads us to this that preserving pollinators in human-dominated landscapes seems to be imperative. We don't have too many other options, so we really have to think about how we can do this and sort of maybe move more sustainably towards urbanization. So I'll very quickly walk you through a couple of small studies that we've done about bees in cities. So this was the study that I mentioned earlier, where we sampled bees across a gradient of urbanization. So we had sites that were more central to the city, and they spread north and south of the city. The sites at the very extremities, those are rural areas. So yeah, we have a gradient of urbanization, and we looked at how bees are doing across these sites. We set up these pan traps, and that's how we sample for. So what we found was that urban spaces like cities seem to have a lot of floral richness. So they have a lot of variety of plants. And this can be for so many reasons. This can be because we like growing different plants in our gardens, and everybody grows different things. It could also be because we plant lots of different kinds of trees for maybe ornamental or shade purposes in cities. And maybe we use less chemicals than agricultural seeds. So it could be a whole list of reasons. But a lot of studies are also saying the same nowadays, that urban spaces seem to be able to support good bee diversity. So this sort of led us to think about exactly what in a city makes it favorable or unfavorable for bees. So this is an ongoing study, and you can see our study sites on the left. That's the map of Bangalore, and that's the limits of the city. So this time we decided that we don't want to do the whole gradient of urbanization, because we feel that what is happening in the city itself is really interesting. So we are sampling green spaces in the city. So these are anything from, say, small home gardens to neighborhood parks to larger areas that are under the forest department, or even large institutions. So we are looking at how bees react to landscape factors, and from this we hope to learn what it is that really kind of influences bee populations in cities. So part of this is the Bee Garden project, where, as Priya mentioned earlier, we've set up these structures which we called bee hotels. We've set it up across Bangalore. We have around 50 to 60. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to sort of see what bees exist right in the city. And these are bees that are not captured in the typical kind of bee sampling exercise that is done, with pan traps, like you can see on the right-hand side. These pan traps mainly capture smaller social bees. And there are lots of other kinds of bees which are not social, which are a little more solitary in their in the way they live. And those bees don't build honey bee hives, the typical hexagonal shaped structure that you think of when you say honeybee. You think of that. They don't build these hives at all, and they like to make cavities or use previously made cavities, and they nest in wood, bamboo, and even soil. So, in fact, most species of bees are at this type, and only very few, around 4 species of bees are social and honey making. So, we are also trying to see what these kind of bees like, and how they could sort of better be supported in the city. Uh, Another reason why these bees are very interesting from the food perspective is because the bees that I'm talking about, that are, these solitary bees, cavity nesting bees, these are excellent pollinators of a lot of our vegetable and fruit plants. And these are typically, plants that belong to the Solanaceae family, or the golds. So uh, only these bees can best pollinate these plants, because they use different techniques. These bees are bigger and stronger, and they sort of use this technique called buzz pollination, where they kind of move their flight muscles to kind of produce a vibration which dislodges the pollen particles from the flower. of these vegetables and fruits, and only this technique can, successfully pollinate these plants. So the bees that live in bee hotels are the kinds that pollinate your tomatoes, brinjal, and lots of other chilies and peppers and everything else. So we see that there's a great scope to kind of involve them with any edible gardening or urban agriculture initiative that one would wish to undertake. Another plus is that these bees, unlike honeybees, they are not aggressive because they don't have a hive to defend. So they don't sting unless you really try to catch it and irritate it or something like that. So they can be sort of safely hosted right close to where you live, and you don't have to worry about safety in the way you would have to worry about if there are honeybee hives right outside your house. So I think what really we discovered through our study, which was initially about bees, like Priya mentioned, we wanted to study bees, but it really became apparent that this nexus, that is the pollinator, food, nutrition nexus, and the urban space also fits right in. So I'll tell you what that is. So as you can see, a lot of food crops in the world require pollinators. And interestingly, pollinator dependent crops are very amenable to growing in cities. And that's because they have low space constraints. So it's not like you're trying to cultivate rice in your balcony. You don't need that kind of space for these plants. And you also see that these foods provide a lot of micronutrients that other foods do not provide you. So it's a very sort of interesting intersection of all these points. And this led us to kind of look at what's happening in terms of the edible gardening scene in Bangalore. This is the result of a survey that was done online during COVID times. So we asked Bangaloreans a couple of questions, and I'll just present the ones which have interesting answers. So we asked people if they grow fruits and vegetables in their garden, and we were surprised to see that around 32% said yes. We had around 300 respondents. We also wanted to see what people grow in their gardens, and we see that, of course, a lot of people grow flowers, ornamental plants, but then a good number also grow things like chilies and veggies, and also fruits. Herbs are also another prominent group. And what really sort of make us feel sort of confident about going down this path is the fact that a lot of people who don't have an edible garden seem to be interested in having one. So around 19% said that, 81% said that yes, they want to have an edible garden when they don't have one. So we hope to sort of use edible gardens as a stepping stone towards supporting bees in small green spaces like our gardens and homes that we have some control over. So, yes, so this is how we sort of tie up the pollinator, the urban pollinator, and food and edible landscape, all of these things, and we sort of hope to use this as both a way of generating data about what bees are out there in our city, and also to understand how best we can support them, and also to see how they can be integrated within our food systems easily. So I just sort of end with this quote by the director of UNESCO 2011. The way humanity manages or mismanages its nature-based assets, including pollinators, will in part define a collective future in the 21st century. The fact is that of the 100 crop species that provide 90% of the world's food, over 70 are pollinated by bees. So yeah, these are our funders for the various studies that I mentioned. Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Chetna. Before we'll anyway open it up to everyone, but there was a question from Reagan, which I thought I would anyway share with you. He asks, why do greens have a low pollinator dependence? Is there a reason?
Sure. So if I understand correctly, you mean greens such as spinach and coriander, mint, those kind of vegetables.
I was asking because, I mean, they may be leaves, but in order to plant them, they're highly dependent on seeds. So even if you might be eating them in a salad and they're not pollinated, but if you have to grow more, I guess most of them are grown by seeds. So that was my question.
You're right. Because they are the plants' leaves that we're eating, so they don't need pollination, like you said. But of course, that's the reason you have categories of pollinator dependence. There are lots of food crops which aren't really depending on them for the food, for producing the food part that we eat, but they might require pollination for, like you said, making healthy seeds so that you can have healthy crops in further generations. So that's what it sort of boils down to, that it's just varying degrees of dependence. Yeah, and in fact, a lot of
Thank you.
I just like to add that a lot of herbs, and I see this in this tulsi plant that that's just outside my window. It supports so many bees. In fact, I see bees, small bees that come to the tulsi flower that I can't identify, and I sort of am trying to get them identified. But so that's the thing. Even if the plant doesn't need pollination to set fruit or seed, it can still support pollinators in many cases. It can still provide food, pollen and nectar for the bees or for any other pollinator.
Thanks. Thank you for explaining.
Great. Thank you, Reagan and Chetna. Just opening it up. I mean, Srijata and I probably have some questions, but we'll wait until, others have a chance to raise anything that's on their minds.